As parents, we get so much joy and excitement from watching our kids take on their first milestones, whether it's sitting up on their own, rolling over, crawling, walking. We love it, and there's probably none better than hearing them take their first attempt at saying mama, saying dada. Those first words are so special. But what if you find yourself with a kid who's a little bit delayed? What if they're behind on milestones? What if they're not talking? They're not communicating yet? That speech delay is a way more common issue than you might realize, and there's more options to help that kid than you probably realize too. The root cause of so many speech delays has often been there for years or months before the speech delay is actually showing up, and we often see that it is linked to the very start of life, maybe birth intervention and stress, things that happen during that pregnancy journey. So in this video, I want to explain a little bit of this overlooked factor that is often affecting speech delay. And I want to introduce you to a completely new approach, a nervous system focused approach that is going to actually address the root cause of what is happening with the speech delay rather than some of the symptomatic focused approaches of traditional OT and traditional speech therapy. I can't help but think of so many of our amazing Thrive kiddos when we're talking about speech delays, and there's a common theme that what happens, whether it's that, they're in the 1.5, 2 to 3 range when they start, or even older than that, they're super concerned that they're not talking yet, or they're not communicating at an age-appropriate level. Maybe they're using some words, but not expressing them as much as they should, or not putting sentences together. That is often a big stress and concern early on, but I can think of so many humorous conclusions to that journey where a few months, a few years down the road, parents will tell us they catch themselves maybe they're bored, or they're not bored, they're overstimulated, they're annoyed, they're hearing their kid talk too much, and they get a little bit bothered or frustrated by it before catching themselves and realizing, wait a minute, this is what I was praying for, this is what I was hoping for, this is what I was seeking answers for so long, and again, to so many therapies and approaches. When you get on the other side of it, you're like, oh my gosh, when is this kid gonna stop talking? We've been able to celebrate that moment with so many parents. And then you're faced with a different problem, right? Because kids that have a lot of words can be overstimulating and they can drain your own nervous system. But we are celebrating that problem instead of trying to get the kid out of that stuck fight or flight survival mode state where they can't communicate, they can't express themselves. And that's leading to a whole host of other focus and emotional regulation and other challenges. So what is actually going on when we have kids dealing with this? Well, there's an underlying theme that we see in probably 80 to 90% of kids dealing with that speech delay that are going through that process that we just walked through, right? Where they're not talking and then they're talking too much. 80 to 90% of the time, those kids have some sort of early life trauma. Maybe that's a birth trauma, birth intervention stress, whether it was forceps, vacuum extraction, induction, C-section, some sort of big early life trigger or stress that we see leading to that down the road speech delay. You might not think about it, but stuff like colic, ear infections, torticollis and plagiocephaly, trouble latching and nursing, we see those as the precursors to those bigger neurodevelopmental challenges later on in life, just like the speech delay is the precursor to ADHD, anxiety, sensory processing, and so much more. That's a topic for a different video, but we see that common theme. What is it about that early birth trauma that affects things? Usually when there's that birth stress, birth intervention, in utero positioning, that's a problem, they're crammed in the womb, maybe in an incorrect way, or there's too intensive contractions. The underlying theme of all that is that it injures and damages this very top of the neck. And let's think about this, right? If you have a kid, picture your little baby. I've got my baby Sophia here. If we are having that extra stress and trauma at birth, where is the most likely place that's gonna take place? It is at this very top of the neck, right? Because that is where they're in a C-section or forceps or vacuum, they're pulling at that head and neck, or honestly, even in a boring vaginal birth that maybe had some extra intensity to it, there's so much forceful pressing contractions, and so frequently, even when there's not a named intervention, the birth team is helping pull or guide or turn the shoulders or get the baby out of that birth canal. It's written off as nothing, but we see that as a huge underlying factor that's going to damage our kids' health. And you, of course, know this, right? As a parent, you would never pick your kid up by their head and neck, no matter how old they are, even if you got older kids at this point. But that happens during the birth process, and we don't think anything of it. The most important sensitive regions of our nervous system are right up here. That central nervous system, the brain, extends into the brain stem, and this upper cervical spine is right where the vagus nerve lives, which is your body's main regulation, calming, rest, digestion, wellness center. That is going to be impacted in a lot of our centers for speech. On all three of the steps of speech production that we're going to talk about, it's going to be affected by that upper cervical or upper neck birth injury or birth trauma. So That is going to set our nervous system behind the 8 ball and really, really mess up development, which is why we see it connected to so many other things, right? Because it's not just speech that's affected in that sense, it's digestion, spitting up, latching, and everything else that I just mentioned. So this nervous system interference, or this nervous system stress, which you'll hear us refer to as subluxation, that affects development in really two different ways. I think of that in the local sense, in like the specific region, and then the global big picture development sense. So if we're talking about that local sense, we're saying, okay, what area of the nervous system, what area specifically of that central nervous system or the body's operating system, what is affected there? So when we hone in on that CNS is going to be majorly impacted in that very top of the neck, like we've been talking about, right? And that is where the vagus nerve lives. That is where some of the formulation centers for speech and that processing takes place. So that is the immediate local issue. But then there's a broader one too. We see kids that have that early trauma, whether it is the birth process or some other trigger, they get stuck in a state of stress. Their nervous system, instead of in a place of growth, development, wellness, and optimization, they get stuck in fight or flight. And when you're in fight or flight, when you're in survival mode, your body is really smart. It's not going to waste resources. It's not going to waste energy. And if it thinks that the world is just some war zone that you need to survive the day, you don't need higher level emotional regulation and cognitive function and speech and communication skills, right? You're a primitive caveman that just has to fight and make it through the day. And so neurologically, those higher level brain functions are going to get put on the back burner. You don't really develop in that way because your nervous system doesn't prioritize it, right? It's like, hey, if we're in stress, if we're in fight or flight, this doesn't matter. And that fight or flight balance, that can show up anywhere neurologically, but that vagus nerve is the biggest brake pedal. It's the biggest calming influence. So that is another reason that early trauma in life sets kids behind the 8 ball, because it's the only thing they've ever known, right? If that birth stress happens on day one, they start development in survival mode. And the more ingrained those pathways are, the harder it is to undo, the harder it is to get them back on the right path. Which that's kind of a side note into care planning. What we're digging into when we're going through someone's case history is figuring out how intense are these problems? How long have they been there? So we have a roadmap to undoing it, right? More severe challenges takes more to undo. And that's why we love helping kids early as another side tangent, because the earlier we can get to that developing nervous system, the more potential there is and the easier it is to get them back on track. So we have that global, that local interference, and that's honestly where traditional therapies missed the mark. Because either speech or language and OT stuff, it's focused on more of that muscular control and missing the neurological piece of it. Muscles are kind of dumb. They don't do anything on their own. They just do what the nerves are telling them to do. So if we miss that neurological development piece of it, we're never going to get to the real issue here. So let's explain that speech process here. I mentioned there's 3 steps to speech earlier. All 3 of these are going to be negatively impacted by that subluxation. First, we have to have the sensory input, right? If you're watching this video, you're listening to it, you're going to be hearing and taking in the words, right? So that is a complex function in and of itself. The sensory perception, we've got to hear properly. The next step is the coordination or the integration. So that CNS, your central nervous system, has to process everything you're hearing, has to make sense of it, and then coordinate what is the appropriate response. Whether that response is an action for the kid, right? When you're telling them to pick up their clothes or to do something, or the response is communication back to whoever's speaking to you. So that output then is step 3. So there's the input, the sensory input, the coordination, the integration, and then the output. That is the motor control piece of it, right? Your tongue, your lips, your mouth has to be able to form these specific sounds that you need to make. And that is complex. All 3 of those steps are really, really complicated and take a lot of neuromuscular regulation and control. That neuromuscular piece of it, that 3rd step, that is what speech therapy, OT does a really good job of, because they help build up those muscles in the lips, in the tongue, in the mouth. Or maybe there's the piece of it that's tie related, right? Oral ties, tongue ties, that can be connected here too. The problem is we've seen so many kids, and honestly most of them who are coming in for speech delays, they've had the ties revised already. They've been in OT and speech therapy already, and they're still stuck. It's made progress, they've made improvements with it, but because either that nervous system is still in a global state of fight or flight, or those regulation centers, the nerves that are controlling the output from those specific areas, if those are still dysfunctional, you're never really going to get to that maximum potential, and you're never going to get to really where they should be. So this isn't just a muscular issue. This isn't just a structural issue. It's that neurofunctional control piece of it. Guys, I hope this helps. If you're looking for the next steps and you're like, okay, this makes sense, what do I do? Please let us help. Reach out. There's really 3 things that I would say we need to do. One is dig into the case history, right? Just get to know your kid, get to know your story more, and figure out, is this someone who has been dealing with these issues, that speech delay, not just for the last 6 months that you noticed it, or once they started being delayed in their milestones, but were there these warning signs of the birth process, of colicky, fussy, refluxy, not latching babies, or torticollis, ear infections, so on. Has this been brooding for longer than you expect? So that's step 1. Step 2 is actually measure this nervous system function. That's what our insight scans are for. A huge part of our neurological exam is objectively measuring and quantifying the nervous system so we can track it as we go throughout that care plan. And that's step 3, is having a customized, specific care plan for whatever is going on in that child's life, so that we can then put together the perfect game plan of frequency and adjustment protocols and techniques to get them unlocked, get that healing mode turned on, out of stress, back into growth and development, and see what's possible. Because that's the thing, is our bodies are so smart. Internally, we know how to heal, we know how to thrive, we know how to be well. The goal of our care, the goal of chiropractic, is just to unlock that healing potential. So if that's what you're missing for your kid, please reach out, send us a message, give us a call. We'll walk you through what that whole exam process looks like and make sure that we get your kid on the right path and get them back to thriving.